Thank you to DistroKid for sponsoring this video and supporting my channel. Hey, welcome back to another video. I'm Ivan Calderon, and today we're making a beat. Okay, so for this one, I opted to do another breakdown video because that will give me enough time to really talk about some of the production techniques like sound selection and arrangement, which is one of my favorite parts about this specific beat. Now, this one is inspired by the current trend of 80s pop, 70s disco pop, which is kind of being spearheaded by The Weeknd at the moment. Of course, it is still in my own style, but there's still a lot of things for you to pick up and kind of take with you. So let's get started. Now, as with all other beats, let me play you first the chorus, the main part, and then we'll kind of just break it down together. Here we go. So this one started out with the drums. Now the drums, for a lot of pop music, they carry a 4 to the floor pattern. It's very basic, so kick on every beat, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you have a snare or a clap on every 2 and 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and that is exactly what we did here. So if I solo those, this is what we get. Now, a couple things to point out here. These samples are really good, and they are from a sample pack on Splice called Oliver's Power Tools 3. I believe Oliver is actually a production duo, but I absolutely love their packs. They have 3 out, and they have amazing samples in there for just one-shots, percussive loops, fills, I mean, you name it, I cannot recommend them enough. Now for this basic pattern, I do have one of their kicks and one of their snares. The kick is not processed at all, but the snare does have a little bit of a plate reverb, which I brought over from the Verb Suite's classic plugin from the Slate All Access bundle. If I were to take that away, this is what this sounds like. Very dry. And that, of course, is with the reverb. From there, we moved on to a hi-hat. Now, this one is from Palace, also from Splice, and I created that using my Beatmaker's toolbar. I've talked about that extensively, so I'll just link it down below for you guys. Really easy to create drums that way, but this is what we get. Now, usually when it comes to hi-hats, I love to fluctuate or alternate the velocity of the hats to kind of create this movement in the drum section, but because I added a lot of percussive material, which I'll show you in a bit, I decided to keep this one very steady to kind of almost make it feel like a metronome. Now those were the first 3 basic elements of the drums, but this is when it starts to get really interesting. Now moving on, I brought in the live hi-hat loop, which again came from that Oliver's Power Tools 3 pack, and that sounds like this with the current elements that we already had. Now, the one thing that I want to point out here about this loop is that it did not sound like this by default. Initially, it had that little open and close hi-hat flare in 2 places, so it sounded like this. Now that sounds great. However, as I started to add different elements later on, which I'll show you here in a little bit, they started to clash with that little flare. So I decided to kind of cut it out and replace it with a segment of that loop that was more consistent. Next up, I brought in a percussion loop, also from the Oliver's Power Pack tools, and this is what that sounds like. Now that loop is kind of special because there's a lot of texture going on. There's a lot of like background noises. There's a lot of elements, some cowbells, muted hi-hats. If you listen to it by itself, this is what we get. There's also some panning going back and forth. So it's just a really good loop to include in here to add some sort of texture and kind of just spice things up. Last but not least, the last thing we added here was a shaker just to finish off that rhythmic kind of movement piece that I wanted to add. And this is what that sounds like together. So that really was the skeleton, the foundation for the drums. Everything else that came afterwards were really just kind of like embellishments, and I'll show you what I mean here in a minute. Now the next thing that I added was a clap. The clap comes in on every 4, I believe, so. Now this clap is also from that Oliver pack, so just go pick it up. If you have Splice, go get those. I'm telling you, they're great. Now for that clap, I did end up sending it to a Hall verb with a really long decay time, about 4 seconds, and that sounds like this by itself. Just kind of makes it sound really big and grandiose and fills in those gaps, so it sounded really nice. From there, the next thing I added was an open hat. Now this one was really special because it's kind of minor. You'll probably miss it in the mix if you're not paying attention, but it really adds to the groove here. Now it is on the upbeat, so 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and take a listen. 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and once you combine it with the clap, it kind of creates this really nice relationship if you take a listen. It's almost as if the clap and the open hat are creating this sort of like groove by themselves, but once we combine everything from before, this is what we get. Now the last few elements here were just some crashes, so we have one big EDM crash with a big long tail, and then a more traditional crash. Combined, they sound like this. Now for the riser, all I did was I took that big EDM crash, reversed it, faded in the intro, and I added this Transgate plugin from the Kilohertz company, and that sounds like this. If I were to take it off, with it on again. But okay, the drums in their entirety sound like this. Now that we had a good rhythmic foundation, the next thing to do was to add some sort of bass. Now I normally don't start off my melodies with bass, but for this one I really wanted to have a nice groovy bass line and then kind of bass everything around it. So what I did was I took my bass guitar, it's a 5-string jazz bass, and I played this. Now don't be fooled, I'm not that great at bass. I recorded this in parts using Studio One's layer feature, and I use this all the time to record my guitars as well. I've done a full video on it, so if you want to check it out, I'll link it for you right up here. In any case, that clean DI track sounded like this. And then to process it, what I did was I brought in a Guitar Rig 6 from Native Instruments, and I believe this one is a Clean Plec Bass preset, which has all these things in there, and it made it sound like this. Just nice and beefy. A little bit of distortion in there as well. Then I added in an EQ, just kind of cut off everything below 50, everything below or above 2000, just to kind of really concentrate that sound. And then finally, I added a UAD Little Labs Voice of God, which is basically a bass resonance enhancer or bass frequency enhancer. And again, our bass sounds like this. Nice, thick, and beefy. You add in the drums. Now, once we had this down, we needed to add some sort of keys. Now, when it comes to 80s pop, 70s disco pop, there's a lot of synths going on. There's a lot of like Rhodesy kind of pianos, very ambient, atmospheric, kind of almost euphoric sounds. And the first one that I added was this one here. Now this here basically is a 4-chord structure which starts at the root, goes up, and then just kind of comes down gradually. Now the reason you're seeing it like this on my screen is because I use Serum for this patch, and Serum is a CPU killer. If you have it, you know what I'm talking about. But in Studio One, what you could do to kind of mitigate this is go over to your track, go down to Transform to Audio Track, and then you could either render the inserts or just leave them on there, but make sure to preserve instrument track state. That way, it gets converted to audio, it saves CPU, but you could always come back to the MIDI if you ever want to edit it in the future. Anyway, once I had those keys, I needed a little bit more of like that ambient kind of Rhodes sound, so I added another set of keys, which sound like this. Now the only difference between the chords on the first set of keys and the second, the ones that I just played for you, is that this second set of keys also includes the bass notes that I played with my left hand. Initially, I did play the first set of keys with the bass notes, but as I kind of blended these two together, I started to realize that the low end started to get really rumbly, and it was just kind of clashing, so I decided to remove the bass notes from the first set of keys and only keep them on the second. So if we mix those two together, this is what we get. Now moving on, this being the chorus, the main part of the song or the beat, I wanted to add some sort of umph, some sort of like hit or stab, or maybe even a brass. I ended up settling with a brass sound, and this is what that sounds like. Now taking a closer look here, you'll notice that there is only the bass notes there from the chord progression. I removed the actual triad chord and only kept the bass notes. So then that three-part structure sounds like this. Now the last thing that I did here was I layered that brass with a string, which was just on a higher register. So the brass was down here, the string is up here, and that string sounds like this. Same notes, but together, this is what you get. And then with the keys, now those strings are a little bit more synth oriented, which does help the vibe of the song. Hey there, before we continue with this beat, I wanted to take a minute and thank the sponsor for this video, DistroKid. DistroKid is a digital distributor, and with plans starting at $20 a year for unlimited uploads, it is by far the easiest and most affordable way to release your music to all streaming platforms. Not only that, but they also have a ton of additional features that come included with your subscription, like the ability to get verified on Spotify, automatically share revenue with collaborators, upload synced lyrics to Instagram and Apple Music, send song credits to stores, create an official YouTube artist channel, and so much more. Promoting your music is also super easy. DistroKid has a variety of different tools that help you create mini videos, social media promo cards, and even landing pages to share your music and grow your following. If you're looking to release your own music, say maybe your own beat tapes, then click the first link in the description to get 7% off your first year. Thank you so much to DistroKid for sponsoring this video, and now let's get back to the music. Okay, so far we have the keys 1, keys 2, we have the brass and the strings, and they're all kind of working together to kind of make this nice progression, and then the drums. So this is what we have so far. Now that sounds great, but it has no life, it has no movement. So the first thing that I did was I brought in a guitar and I played the same note, the root note of my key, consistently, and then only at the very end, I switched it up to match the chord that I was playing on that section, just to kind of spice it up. So clean DI, the guitar sounds like this. Same note again, change. Now, as far as the processing goes, I brought in a guitar rig just to kind of add some sort of tone. Then I brought in an EQ to kind of just take off everything below 100 Hertz, any of that low end rumble. From there, we added a kickstart. Now this one is probably on my list of most recommended plugins. I'll have to do a video on my most recommended mixing plugins, but this is basically a side chaining plugin that ducks your sound consistently without you having to do any like sort of complicated routing. But this is what this sounds like. Last but not least, we had a bit of a phaser, which in my case is just a phase mistress from Sound Toys. And then our guitar sounds like this. Okay, so moving on, the next movement piece that really kind of added to this beat was the ARP. Now I'm gonna play it for you first clean, then we'll talk about the processing. But this is what it sounds like. Now, a couple things to note here. Number one, we started off with a very nice preset or patch. Again, I believe this was from Serum. And what I did to kind of lay this out or program it was I took the chords from before and I played the triad. So 1, 2, 3, and then I added the octave. So 1, 3, 5, octave. And that's how I got this pattern. And it just follows the progression. Now, in terms of processing, the first thing I did was I brought an EQ and I carved out everything below 300 Hertz and everything above about like 23, even like 25 kilohertz. Very concentrated bell curve, but that's because we wanted to have that filtered sound, and this is what we got. Next up, we added some reverb, so I brought in that Valhalla Vintage reverb with about like a 2 to 3 second decay time, about 40% mix, and this is what we get. Very like Stranger Things-esque, so it sounds really, really cool. Added a kickstart again, just to kind of, you know, duck it in and out, and this is what our ARP sounds like. I did have one more EQ on here, but this is basically just used as an automated sweeping filter for the intro, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Now, one thing that I forgot to talk about real quick is that for the chorus, I also added in a synth bass just to kind of fill in those gaps, because that bass that I played has a lot of them, and if you take a look here, you'll see. So a lot of gaps, very groovy, but it has a lot of gaps. So that synth bass fills in that space. And for this, all I did was I took the chord, specifically I think it was like one of these, and I just kept the bottommost note, but it follows a progression. But the two basses sound like this. But okay, our beat so far, with everything that we've added at the moment, sounds like this. Now, last but not least, we just had a lead. For this beat, I had a two-part lead. The first one, the first patch, sounds like this. In terms of processing, we did have an EQ here just to kind of filter it out a little bit. And then I did send it to a hall verb and to a quarter note delay. Now to kind of spice it up, I brought in a second layer, which is more of like a pluck, but that sounds like this. Again, that's being sent to a hall verb and to a slap delay, and then together, we get this. Okay, now that we have all the elements, here is that chorus one more time. Okay, so let's talk about the arrangement, because I'm really proud of this one. Now, when it comes to pop, you would not be mistaken if you went from intro to chorus. That happens a lot. I decided to go a little bit more traditional, so I went intro, verse, pre-chorus, chorus, and then it just kind of repeats. Now, for the intro, I kept that ARP, right? I kept the guitar, which is pedaling that one note, and I kept the synth bass. Oh, and the first set of keys. So this is what that sounds like. Now, a very important part of this intro is that sweeping filter that I talked about earlier. Here's what this is doing. We're starting at about 1,000 hertz, and it's opening up as the chorus or as the intro progresses. So here's what that sounds like again. Now the cool thing is that as it finishes opening up, that gated riser starts to come in, so it blends in quite nicely. Now if you wanna learn how to do this, super simple. What you wanna do is you wanna go over to your automation button here, pop that open, then you're gonna click on this little bar here, drop that down. By default, you're only going to have volume and pan, but what you wanna do is hit add and remove. From here, drop down this menu where it says inserts and look for your plugin. So if you wanted to do this plugin here, this is another EQ, drop that down, and then just look for what you're looking for. So for me, it was band 1 frequency, and all you have to do is hit add. Finally, once you have it in your little window, all that's left to do is just kind of to write the automation of what you want to happen. So this is what mine looks like. We started at 1,000, right? And then it just kind of goes up and opens up to the full extent of the filter. Now you also notice that if you want this to happen throughout other points of the song, you also have to copy that into that specific section. But okay, moving on to the verse here, this is where things start to get a little bit interesting. So we drop into the beat, but not all the drums are present. Now the verse is really divided into two sections. The first one is kind of more calm, and the second one picks back up because we start to add more things. Now in the first half, we have the kick, the snare, the hi-hat, and then the shaker. So that sounds like this. We also had the live bass guitar and the first set of keys. Now for the second half of the verse, things start to pick up. So then what I did was I brought in that electric guitar, I brought in the percussion loop, and I brought in the open hats. So that transition sounds like this. So then that was the verse. Now in terms of the pre-chorus, it's very common in a lot of like EDM and pop songs to kind of cut things out. So you come back down to then bring them back up into the chorus, and that's exactly what I did. So then for that pre-chorus, we have the main set of keys, which is consistent throughout the entire beat, but we also brought in that brass. I brought in that first layer of the lead, which is more subtle and mellow. I brought in the guitar. I brought in that synth bass, and then no drums. So the pre-chorus sounds like this. Now, the one thing that I want to point out here is that there's a lot of things you could do to keep your listeners' attention if you start to play around with different sounds. And one of the more common ones that I use is a call and response method. A lot of people use this, it's not just me. But if you take a look at the brass and the lead, they're kind of playing off of each other. Take a listen. In any case, once that finishes, then of course you guys know the chorus comes back in. This is when the ARP comes back in, and this is where pretty much everything else comes back in, including the clap, because the clap is only present in the chorus. As far as the rest of the structure goes, it's almost a duplicate of the first. So we have verse, pre-chorus, chorus. At the end, you guys know I always do a breakdown of some sort, which is really just kind of a version or version 2 B-side of the intro. So we have the main keys, we have the ARP, we have the guitar, no drums, but we do have those leads. But there you have it. That is a beat in the style of like 80s pop, 70s disco pop, the Weeknd type beat, if you will. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, let me know in a comment down below. And if not, then also let me know in a comment down below. Once again, thank you to DistroKid for sponsoring this video. They're a huge supporter of this channel and they really help make these videos come to life. So huge shout out to them. Link down below for that as well. But as always, like this video if you like, subscribe if you're not already, but I'll see you on the next one.